Our next talk this afternoon is Ryan Anderson, who is the William E. Simon Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. He'll be speaking on, is the American experiment a failure? And his talk will be followed by questions and answers. So you can go ahead and submit your questions as we listen to Ryan Anderson speak.
Great. Thank you for the introduction, Father Ambrose. I think there must have been a schedule change. In the meantime, the actual title is going to be Religious Liberty is Important, but Not Enough. And that's the argument that I want to make this afternoon, is that religious liberty is really important. It's a real human right, but it's not enough as a political matter, as a policy matter, as a legal matter, especially not in this moment in which American Catholics find ourselves. So in the time I have, I want to cover four things to give you an outline of what I hope to accomplish. First, where do we find ourselves right now? Second, what just happened this past term at the Supreme Court, and why this particular moment for saying religious liberty is important but not enough? Third, just a couple broad remarks about the role of government in general that I hope will highlight why focusing on religious liberty isn't going to be enough for us in this particular moment. And then lastly, with whatever time I have left, I want to say a couple things about what do we do now and how do we go about doing it. Okay, so first, where do we find ourselves? I think the reality here is that for the past several decades, secular progressives have advanced the sexual revolution through aggressive government mandates. And so it's a familiar story. A movement that claims merely to want personal freedom, to live and let live. First, it repeals laws that purportedly limit their freedom. Then they use government to subsidize their preferred choices. Then they use government to mandate that other people subsidize their choices. And finally, they use government to punish anyone who disagrees with them. So judicial activism in the name of personal freedom overturns abortion laws protecting unborn babies and then creates a right to abortion. The right to abortion then becomes a demand for government-funded abortion. Then a regulation forcing Hobby Lobby to pay for abortion-causing drugs, and now a movement to punish pharmacists who won't prescribe those drugs, and for doctors and nurses who refuse to participate in abortion. Another example, the judicial redefinition of marriage leads to the, quote, freedom to marry, and then the freedom to marry becomes the duty to bake the cake again. So this spring brought us some welcome rulings from the Supreme Court on religious liberty, and we should celebrate those victories because they matter. And religious liberty is a real human right. And we see this in our Catholic tradition in the Second Vatican Council. Dignitatis Humanae explains that it's based upon the dignity of the human person that we need to have certain political space, political freedom to live out our religious duties. We see some right now in America on the political left giving up on the concept of religious liberty. We see some on the political right trying to narrow religious liberty just to kind of fellow Christians. We as faithful Catholics need to defend religious liberty in its wholeness. A freedom from A to Z, a freedom Sunday through Saturday, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, precisely because it's a real human right. It emanates from human nature, from the dignity of the human person. It's to create the space for us to fulfill our religious duties. But it's not enough because part of our vocation is to be faithful citizens. And what I mean by that is to see that the law, public policy, embodies justice, promotes the common good, supports human flourishing in all of its dimensions. Religious liberty alone can't do this because religious liberty doesn't protect people who aren't religious. Religious liberty doesn't protect other goods and interests that are threatened by bad laws. And religious liberty itself doesn't respond on the merits to the underlying disputed questions of our age, especially today, where so many of those disputed questions focus on anthropology. And they focus in particular on how the sexual revolution gets human anthropology wrong. So we need a more holistic response in terms of legislation, litigation, executive branch regulations. We need ultimately to contend with the truth of the matter. And this is particularly true, I think, with the Supreme Court's ruling this past term in Bostock, which read transgender ideology into our civil rights law. So let me turn to the Supreme Court, second part of my talk this afternoon. Let me mention the three good cases. There were three good religious liberty cases. Let me tell you what they did, and then let me explain why they're not enough. First, in the Espinoza case, the Supreme Court struck down the application of notoriously anti-Catholic Blaine amendments as applied to public funding for private education. So this is good because what it says is that while the Constitution doesn't require the funding of private education, you can't exclude religious schools. In particular, you can't exclude Catholic schools. The logic of the ruling is likely to apply beyond education to all government funding. If you have government funding on the table, you can't single out religious institutions, organizations to not receive funding. Second, in the Little Sisters of the Poor case, the court said that the Trump administration has the authority to protect the religious freedom of the Little Sisters of the Poor from the Obamacare HHS mandate. Another important religious liberty win. And then third, that very same day in Our Lady of Guadalupe, the court said that the constitutional doctrine known as the ministerial exception provides broad protections for religious schools to make staffing decisions for themselves based on their religious mission. Okay, so why do I say these aren't enough? First, let's just take the education ruling. As important as providing equal protection to government funding is, it doesn't do anything to address what's going on at the government-run schools that we call public. If the government-run schools are indoctrinating students with the gender unicorn, if they're forcing girls to compete against boys who identify as girls, if they're teaching the 1619 Project, we should be just as concerned about what's going on in our public schools as we are with what's going on in our Catholic schools, and ensuring that we have equal access to funding for those Catholic schools. So religious liberty isn't enough because school choice doesn't exist everywhere, unfortunately. First problem there. And then second, the vast majority of American children, including the vast majority of Catholic children, attend public schools. And so we need to be contending for what's going on at those public schools. Second, the Little Sisters of the Poor case. It's great that the Trump administration can protect the Little Sisters of the Poor. It's not enough, first, because the mandate still exists. Even today, 3.5 years into the Trump administration, the Obamacare mandate promulgated by the Department of Health and Human Services still exists, telling all healthcare plans that they have to provide cost-free coverage of 20 contraceptives, 4 of which carry an FDA label saying they can cause early-term abortions. That's a huge problem. It's not just a religious liberty problem. That's a pro-life problem. That's a good medicine problem. That's a role of government problem. That said, while it's great that the Trump administration has protected the Little Sisters of the Poor, the state of Pennsylvania has already announced that they're going to continue pursuing legal measures to try to undo this protection. And Vice President Joe Biden had announced that if he's elected president, in response to that Supreme Court ruling, he's going to take us back to where we were before the Hobby Lobby decision. So even though the Little Sisters of the Poor have gone to the Supreme Court on 3 different occasions and have won on all 3 of those occasions, they're not finished. We now know that should we have a change in administration in DC, they're going to be threatened yet again. And then the third ruling that day was the ministerial exception. It's a great ruling. It protects the ability of religious institutions to continue to staff and to hire based upon their religious mission. If you're running a Catholic school, you want Catholic teachers who are going to support the mission of Catholicism. It's almost a no-brainer that you had to go to the Supreme Court for this. And so some people were saying, well, this is good. This limits the Bostock decision. Bostock was about employment law. It said that the no discrimination on the basis of sex provision now reached into transgender status and transgender identity, and that this would now be a balancing act. It's not enough. Why do I say it's not enough? Is that first, this doesn't even cover non-ministerial employees. And so we're going to have to litigate what the religious liberty exemptions in Title VII of the Civil Rights Act look like. Second, it doesn't cover other situations of employment. So what if you're the Green family and you own Hobby Lobby? Does your healthcare plan now need to cover sex reassignment procedures, or else you're guilty of discrimination on the basis of transgender status? That's going to have to be litigated. And then if we've redefined the word sex to mean transgender identity in the employment civil rights statute, why not in other civil rights statutes? Why not in our education law, Title IX? Why not in public accommodations, other places at the state and federal level where we have these protections? And what's at stake there? We're going to see privacy and safety of women at shelters, equality on athletic fields, and good medicine. Those are things at stake for everyone, whether you're religious or not, right? It's not just Catholic students who don't want to have males in their locker room. It's not just Catholic students who don't want to be losing championship races to boys who identify as girls. It's not just Catholic children who shouldn't have their bodies experimented with. Again, religious liberty is important. It's not enough. Okay, the third part of what I want to say this afternoon is how should we think about the role of government in general on these questions? How should we think about what the proper role of the state is here? And I think the best way to think about this is to think about this how Catholics have been thinking about it all along. The role of the state is to promote the common good. It's to promote justice. It's to promote human flourishing authentically understood. But the state doesn't do this directly. It frequently does this indirectly. What I mean by that is that the state doesn't tell you who you should marry, or even if you should marry, but the state should embody the truth about what marriage is in law. Right? So the state's promoting justice, the truth, the common good, human flourishing in its marriage laws, not by prescribing who you should or shouldn't marry, but by saying what marriage is and then allowing you to opt into marriage, to choose to be married and to choose your spouse, right? Marriage has to be, on the Catholic understanding, a consensual relationship. That said, while it's not directly promoting your marital relationship, it certainly can't be neutral with respect to marriage. There's no neutrality with respect to the truth, with respect to justice, with respect to human nature and human goods, and ultimately the common good. There's no neutrality on same-sex marriage. There's no neutrality on puberty-blocking drugs for children. Either the state recognizes and allows these things, or it doesn't. So we can go wrong by thinking the state should be too powerful, but also we can go wrong by thinking the state should be too limited. So how do we decipher, how do we titrate this? And let me give you a quote within the American tradition from Martin Luther King Jr., right? So a non-Catholic thinker, someone who's frequently associated with the left side of the political aisle. In his famous letter from the Birmingham jail, Martin Luther King Jr. says that a just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that's out of harmony with the moral law. To put it in terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal law and natural law. So our vocation as Catholics in the public square, as faithful citizens, is to ensure that man-made law, human law, is in accordance with natural law and the eternal law. We want to ensure, as MLK said, that a man-made code squares with the moral law and the law of God. Because when this doesn't happen, there are consequences. When you violate the natural law, when you get human nature wrong, there are costs. There are human costs to getting human nature wrong. So just look at, in the context of the sexual revolution, what have those costs been to millions of unborn babies, to millions of children who have grown up without their dads, to millions of women and girls who have been used and abused, to millions of men right now, stunted in their development, addicted to pornography, not flourishing, not living what any of these people was designed to live. And now, to take things to the next step, we now have children who don't feel comfortable in their bodies as either a boy or a girl, and activists saying that the appropriate response is to block their puberty, to give them the opposite sex's hormones, to surgically mutilate their bodies with double mastectomies and things like that. These aren't primarily religious liberty issues. There are other goods at stake. There are non-religious people at stake. There's the truth of the matter at stake. And so one way that you could think about this is to ask yourself the question, how do I love my neighbor in law when it comes to healthcare? How do I love my neighbor in law when it comes to education? We shouldn't just think about exempting ourselves from bad laws. We should be doing what we can to promote good law, to ensure that the truth is enacted into law. Another way that I think about this, especially as a relatively new parent, as a new father, is how can both the law and the culture make my job as a conscientious father easier? We want to live in a culture, including a legal culture, where conscientious parents aren't fighting with the culture, aren't fighting with the law, fighting with the government, but actually have the law and the culture supporting their conscientious efforts to raise upright children. The same thing is true with the church and religion. Right? We don't want to see the church fighting with the culture, fighting with the law. We want to see the law and the culture supporting the mission of the church. This is how these things should go together. The law, the culture, the church, the law, the culture, and parents should all be promoting the common good, human flourishing, justice in their respective domains. Right? I don't want the state running baptisms, obviously, but I don't want the state getting in the way of the church doing baptisms. I don't want the state making it less likely that people will want to be baptized. All right, so in the last section, the section 4, what do we do now? How should we think about what we should do now? And for this, I want to draw a parallel to the pro-life movement, because I think the pro-life movement has been pretty successful in avoiding the temptation to say, let's just keep our hands clean. Let's just, advocate for conscience protections or religious liberty. They've been able to walk them at the same time. So as they advocated for conscience protections and religious liberty, they also advocated for overturning Roe v. Wade and ensuring that every child in the womb is protected in law and welcomed in life. They've been able to do both of those things. They've been able to say abortion is unjust killing, Roe v. Wade is a travesty of jurisprudence, and we shouldn't be coercing pro-life doctors into performing abortions. What you would never hear them say is something like this: well, it's okay to kill unborn babies so long as there's a religious liberty exemption for Catholic doctors. Or it's okay to kill unborn babies so long as Catholic babies are protected from abortion laws. So I want to apply that framework, draw a little parallel to say, would we say it's okay to mutilate the bodies of children so long as there's a religious liberty exemption for Catholic hospitals and Catholic doctors? We wouldn't say it's okay to have abortion so long as you have a religious liberty exemption for Catholic doctors and hospitals. So why say it on the question of transgender ideology? We wouldn't say it's okay to mutilate the bodies of children so long as there's a religious liberty exemption for Catholic children, right? Because it's not just religious institutions, religious doctors, nor is it just religious children that we care about. We care about all children. We want to see all of them flourish in their bodies. Same thing's true with education and athletics. We wouldn't say it's okay to have boys competing against girls in athletics so long as there's a religious liberty exemption for Catholic schools. We wouldn't say it's okay to have boys competing against girls in athletics so long as there's a religious liberty exemption for Catholic athletes. Why do I mention this? The left wants to say that the Catholic Church is obsessed with sex. The left wants to say that the Catholic Church is the aggressor in the culture war. None of this is true. The Catholic Church stands on the side of reason and of all of human history in saying that we shouldn't be redefining what marriage is. We shouldn't be redefining the nature of the human person. We shouldn't be killing innocent human beings. There is a culture war in America, but the aggressors are the secular liberals who are seeking and who have sought successfully in Roe v. Wade to overturn our abortion laws, who sought successfully in Obergefell to redefine marriage, who are now attempting to redefine sex and gender. And they've had one little bit of success in employment law under Bostock. And so it falls to us now to do whatever we can to, one, limit that bad transgender ruling from going any further. Sex from being redefined as gender identity in healthcare law, in education law, in athletics, et cetera, but then to undo as much of this damage as possible. For as long as we live under a legal regime in which children can be killed at will in the womb, where marriage has been redefined, where sex and gender are being redefined, there will be human costs, because there are always human costs to getting human nature wrong. So with that, let me welcome Father Ambrose back, and I believe we have some time for your questions and perhaps some answers.
Ryan, hello. Thanks for the really fine presentation. It's good to see you again, even if it's across the continent here.
Great. It's great to be with you.
We had some questions come in from our viewers, and I'll tell you what some of those are, maybe give you some time to answer, and then if the conversation can continue, then we'll do that too. James asks, how do the advocates of restriction on religion use language to advance their position. For example, I have heard the freedom of religion modified to read freedom to worship. And how does maybe that fit into the questions at stake now?
That is a great question, and it's very perceptive, because what you saw in particular in the last administration was that you saw both John Kerry, Secretary of State Kerry, and Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State Clinton, starting to use the phrase freedom of worship instead of the free exercise of religion or freedom of religion or religious liberty. And that has particular connotations overseas, where it might be used to limit the freedom of Catholics to evangelize, where it might be used to limit the freedom of people to convert, especially in Muslim majority countries where you see blasphemy laws, where you see anti-conversion laws. So it was particularly problematic in a foreign policy context. The stakes are much higher with religious liberty overseas. And so I don't want to in any way equate what's happening domestically with what's with what's happening to our brothers and sisters across the globe. But it matters because then that same rhetoric was used. Let's take the Little Sisters of the Poor. Oh, they have freedom to worship. When the Little Sisters are inside the four walls of their chapel, they can pray the rosary, they can use incense, they can do whatever they want to do. But as soon as the Little Sisters of the Poor start ministering to the elderly and to the dying, as soon as the Little Sisters of the Poor start embodying Christ's love for the least of these, they have to abide by Caesar's rules, right? Because it's only the freedom of worship that they now have. They don't have the fullness of the free exercise of religion. On a sound understanding, on a Catholic understanding, religion is something we do every day of the week, every hour of the day, every minute of the hour. It's not just what we do inside of the chapel. Jesus wants all of our lives, all of our activities to be ordered to him, serving him in the least of these. And so you can see how this plays out in Little Sisters of the Poor. Another way in which they use language is to claim that the free exercise of religion is now, quote, a license to discriminate. And what they want to say is that the Little Sisters of the Poor are discriminating against women by not covering contraception and abortion-causing drugs in their healthcare plan. They want to say that Catholic adoption agencies are discriminating against people in same-sex marriages by saying that orphans deserve both a mother and a father. And they want to say that when good religious liberty firms like the Becket Fund for Religious Liberty, like Alliance Defending Freedom, that when they're defending Jack Phillips the baker or the Little Sisters of the Poor or Catholic adoption agencies, that what they're really advocating for is the, quote, license to discriminate rather than the free exercise of religion. Why is this so important? Let me say one other thing. What the Little Sisters of the Poor believe, what Jack Phillips the baker believes, what Catholic adoption agencies believe is the truth. This isn't just an idiosyncratic belief that they want to have freedom to be a bigot, they want to have freedom to discriminate. They want to have freedom to live in accordance with the truth. And so I think our engagement, our defense needs to make both sets of arguments, that what they believe is true to human nature and that they should be free to live in accordance with it.
Great. That's you've touched several times in your talk and also in this response to James's question there, Ryan, about objective truth and that we can know it and that it must inform law, which is in accordance with just law, which is in accordance with a common good. So we have a question from Thomas who asks about, well, what if religion, as far as the government is concerned, is including things that are obviously not true religions? He mentioned Satanism, but you mentioned a number of other things. So the whole gender ideology exemplified in the gender unicorn, for example, where what is being legislated or decided by the Supreme Court is so manifestly not considering an objective truth. Apart from defending that in our private discourse and public discourse, insofar as that's possible, where do you think that this divergence might find some kind of convergence again? What is to be done in that to bring the whole world of truth or natural law or revealed law back into the conversation?
Yeah, that is a great question with lots of aspects to it. Let me say a couple of things. First, I think, look, if someone's making a religious liberty claim on behalf of Satanism, we should point out that Satanism is not a religion, because the nature of religion, from religio, is about the duties that we owe to the Creator. It's not about worshiping a fallen angel. It's not about serving the enemy of the Creator. And so, from the very get-go, what we're talking about, if we're talking about Satanism, is we're not talking about religion. That the reason that the Catholic Church and the sound philosophical traditions think about religious liberty as a human right is that there needs to be a certain space to fulfill duties to the Creator. That's the way that James Madison spoke about it. He said, what's a right amongst men is a duty to the Creator. And that's why there are limits on what Caesar can do, because we should render to God the things that are God and to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. On some of the other questions, I think there are going to have to be limits on how we think about religious liberty claims. If someone's making a religious liberty claim that my religion requires me to kill an unborn baby, or my religion requires me to block puberty for my child, the way that the Catholic Church talks about religious liberty is that it has to be exercised consistently with the demands of justice and the common good. The way that American law talks about this is to say that the sincere exercise of religion can be limited by compelling government purposes pursued in the least restrictive way possible. Now, if ever there was a compelling government interest, it's in preventing innocent human beings from being killed. If ever there was a state interest, it's in preventing children from having their bodies mutilated. And the second part of that test, the least restrictive way possible, the problem with abortion is not that too much of it is a bad thing. The way you might say that, certain emission standards, you can only have so much pollutant, and once you cross a certain level, too much of it is a bad thing. No, the problem with abortion is that any killing of an unborn child is a problem. So compelling government purpose, protecting innocent human life, least restrictive way possible, no innocent lives can be slaughtered. And so I think that's how you would have to deal with someone who was claiming, religious liberty case for abortion. And then the last part of the question, I think that we do need to engage in kind of like a form of like intellectual and cultural evangelism, where we just try to help people get back in touch with reality. We need to evangelize in the traditional sense of spreading the gospel, but I also think we need to kind of like spread realism as a philosophical methodology of, there are truths, we can know truths. It's not all kind of like raw silly putty that you can make and remake according to your desires and your will. That at the end of the day, reason has to govern the will. Reason has to govern the emotions, the passions. I think there's just kind of a critical need for getting back to basics.
There's a question that just came in just now. It's kind of fun to have these questions in real time, Ryan, but I think an objection that would occur to many people who are watching, listening, and who have also imbibed the falling away from objective truth that you're just very beautifully and powerfully, encouraging everybody to move back in the direction of, is the separation of church and state argument, right? So that's what everybody always says. And in fact, one of our viewers here today says, what about separation of church and state and not legislating morality? So I think it's a common objection and maybe a good place to dig in.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. Every piece of legislation legislates morality. There's no morally neutral legislation. There's no non-moral legislation. I mean, something as simple as property law. When we say we're going to protect private property, that's a certain moral view. Communism, socialism is another type of moral view. What are the limits of your ownership rights of private property? What can and can't you do with your private property, right? All sorts of moral values that are leading us to try to regulate, in this case, property regulation. The same thing is true for our homicide laws. That's a moral position. That's immoral for me to kill my neighbor. And so if it's not a violation of separation of church and state, a violation of legislating morality, for me to say I can't kill my born neighbor, why is it a violation of state or a violation of legislating morality to say that I can't kill my unborn neighbor? It strikes me that all of these issues are things that we can know through reason, but furthermore, that there's nothing inappropriate with also relying on faith. That part of our fallen condition, the reason why God sends grace, why he sent his son and why he now sends the Holy Spirit, is precisely to repair our fallen nature, to repair our darkened intellect so that we can see the truth more clearly. And provided that the underlying position is true, it shouldn't make a difference whether you know it by faith or by reason. It's a true position, then as Martin Luther King Jr. said, a human law that's not ensquared with the moral law and with God's law. And we can know that both by faith and by reason. Last thing I'll say about separation of church and state is that in the American context, that phrase is almost always abused. What it means is an institutional separation of leadership and authority from political institutions, from leadership and authority of religious institutions. That the president and the bishops aren't the same people and that they shouldn't directly control each other's institutions. But it doesn't mean that the bishops can't speak out when the president does something immoral. And it certainly doesn't mean that religious citizens can't speak out when the Congress or the president does something immoral. The entire point of our citizenship, the entire point of our religious freedom is to be actively engaged, to bring our worldview, our values to the public square, not to kind of shelter them and hide them, not to put the light under a bushel basket. And so with that, I think we're out of time, so I'll turn it back over to you, Father.
I think we're just about wrapping up. That's right. Give people a break before the next talk. Ryan, it's been a real joy. Good to see you. Great to hear from you. And thank you for your wisdom in these really important matters. Thanks. Hope to see you soon.